The morning arrived pale and brittle, the kind of dawn that shivered under a thin veil of frost. Snow had fallen overnight, soft and relentless, blanketing the valley in white silence. The horizon bled faintly gold as the first rays of sun struck the frozen river that threaded through the canyon, its surface fractured into jagged mirrors. A wind whispered through the skeletal pines and bare cottonwoods, carrying the scent of ice and distant wood smoke. In the midst of this quiet expanse, a solitary figure moved with measured patience, a horse beneath him stamping lightly on the crusted snow. The cowboy's coat hung heavy and stiff from frost, its leather cracked and dulled by years of wear. The collar turned up, shielding his neck from the biting air, revealed a line of stubble along his jaw, streaked with gray. He rode slowly, boots scuffing against the frozen crust, hands wrapped in rough gloves that had been patched more than once. The horse, a bay mare with a weary gait, responded to the gentle pressure of the reins, nostrils flaring in the cold, breath forming clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The silence of the valley pressed against them, unbroken except for the creak of leather and the soft crunch of snow beneath hooves. He had been traveling this ridge for hours, though the reason for the journey was more of habit than necessity. The ranch he had once called home had long since passed into someone else's hands. Debts had been paid with cattle, and pride had been cashed in with long days of empty work. He was a man shaped by absence, by the quiet failure of dreams that once felt too large for a single life. His eyes, gray and steady, scanned the horizon, tracing the lines of hills and ridges as if seeking some faint sign of purpose. As he rounded a bend near the old Miller barn, half buried in snow and leaning like a tired sentinel, his attention caught on something unusual. Footprints, small and uneven, traced a path toward the barn-shadowed entrance. The tracks were hurried, desperate, and interrupted in places by drifts that claimed them whole. The cowboy leaned forward slightly in his saddle, eyes narrowing. There had been few travelers this far in the past week, none expected in this stretch of frozen valley. And yet, these tracks suggested life, fragile, urgent, human. A faint whinny rose from within the barn, muffled by its weathered boards. It was a sound that carried both hope and unease, piercing the quiet morning like a small bell in a cathedral of snow. The cowboy's hand went instinctively to the saddle horn, steadying himself. His instincts were old and earned. He had spent years reading the land, understanding how the wind carried sound, how the tracks of a horse or a child could speak louder than any words. He drew a slow breath, tasting the iron tang of frost in the air, and considered what might lie beyond that threshold. For a moment, he wavered, the familiar caution pressing against a rising curiosity. Some days demanded only survival. Some days demanded more. He guided his mare closer, boots crunching lightly, and dismounted with careful deliberation. The snow rose nearly to the tops of his boots, damp and powdery, sticking cold against his legs. The barn loomed ahead, dark inside, its doors barely hanging on rusted hinges. Sunlight skimmed the roof, casting fractured shadows across the frozen ground, and in those shadows the tracks disappeared. He felt the pull of responsibility, the quiet tug of conscience that had guided him before when others had faltered. The valley was empty, but for the faint evidence of life, and that alone was enough to stir him. He approached the door, hand resting lightly on the cold wood. The air inside smelled of straw, old hay, and the faint decay of time left untouched. A horse shifted softly, hooves scraping against the floor, and then a whisper of movement, so slight it might have been imagined, reached his ears. He paused, listening. The sound of a child's breath, uneven and ragged, followed by the shuffle of small feet. The cowboy's eyes softened slightly, tracing the shadows for shapes, recognizing instinctively the presence of fear. He had encountered it before, in men, in animals, and sometimes in himself. The kind of fear that hardened from neglect and cold, that whispered that the world might not care if you froze in silence. He pushed the door gently. It creaked, a long note of surrender, revealing a dim interior. Pale light filtered through cracks in the boards, dust motes drifting like tiny stars in the frozen stillness. And then he saw them. 3 girls huddled together, small and trembling, their faces pale from cold. Their clothes were thin and torn, threadbare from repeated wear, and snow clung to their hair and hems. Between them stood a horse, its coat matted and frosted, eyes wide with the same mixture of fear and trust that the girls' faces carried. One of them, the smallest, peeked from beneath her sister's arm, eyes large and wary, as if measuring whether this stranger was friend or threat. The cowboy swallowed, heart tightening, though he made no sudden move. He could have turned away, left them to whatever peril had driven them here. The thought brushed against him, familiar and tempting. But something else rose, firmer, steadier, the knowledge that leaving the men abandoning not just bodies but hope. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching on the floorboards now softened by old hay, and lowered his hand in a gesture older than words. The smallest girl flinched but did not retreat, curiosity and fear mingling in her wide eyes. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling boards and sweeping snow across the threshold. The valley remained hushed, indifferent, save for the quiet determination now radiating from this man. He knelt slightly to meet the girls at eye level, speaking softly, measured, each word deliberate. The horse shifted closer, nose sniffing the air between them. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, the girls allowed a flicker of cautious trust. The smallest hand moved toward his, fingers trembling but reaching. The cowboy straightened, voice low, carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like a warm coat. He glanced toward the barn door, where tracks in the snow hinted at other presences, at other dangers, but for now, he made a choice. He would stay. He would help. He would, in that quiet morning, decide that some responsibilities were too urgent to ignore, some calls to kindness too insistent to leave unanswered. And in that moment, the valley held its breath, waiting for the next move, as if it too understood that life could hinge on a single act of courage, unspoken but undeniable. The pale light fell across the trio and the horse, highlighting frozen eyelashes, brittle hair, and the rough hands of a man who had known hardship, but not yet the weight of what he was about to confront. He tightened his coat around him, eyes sweeping over the tracks leading back into the wilderness, and whispered to no one but himself, step by step, "We'll get through this." Outside, the wind blew indifferent. Inside, the barn held a fragile warmth of new hope. And the first question of the day lingered in the still air. Who had left these children to the snow, and why? The cowboy would not yet know. But he did know this. Turning away was no longer an option. And as the light grew, stretching across the valley like a promise, the story of fear, of courage, of fragile lives intertwined with an equally fragile horse, had only just begun. The barn's interior was colder than the cowboy had expected, the shadows stretching long and uneven across the straw-strewn floor. A thin shaft of sunlight pierced the gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating motes of dust that hung in the air like drifting snowflakes, suspended in the quiet. The girls huddled closer to the horse, its broad flank a fragile barrier between them and the vast, uncaring cold beyond the barn walls. Their small hands clutched each other, knuckles white, and the youngest's lips trembled as she whispered a soundless prayer that carried more fear than hope. The horse shifted slightly, its breath warm against the girl's frozen cheeks, flaring nostrils sending tiny clouds into the chill air. It made a soft whuffing sound, a gentle reassurance, and the oldest girl laid her hand on its neck, tracing the line of muscle with the tenderness of someone who had learned early that care was survival. The cowboy's eyes softened as he watched, noting the precision in their small, deliberate movements, the instinct to protect the creature that shared their fate. In that barn, surrounded by shadows and frozen light, he saw both fragility and resilience intertwined, and he felt the first stirrings of a responsibility heavier than the pack on his own back. He knelt slowly, boots creaking softly on the worn floorboards, and let his gaze settle on the smallest girl. Her eyes, wide and wary, mirrored the frozen landscape outside. Vulnerable, stark, yet faintly alive with a cautious curiosity. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, giving her the choice to respond to his presence or recoil. When she finally shifted a small hand toward him, trembling fingers brushing the edge of his coat, he allowed a brief, careful smile. Not the bright smile of ease, but the muted acknowledgement that she could trust him, at least for this moment. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of concern without judgment. The youngest girl shook her head, and the middle one, older than her years suggested, glanced toward him with sharp, guarded intelligence. She had seen neglect before, he realized, and measured people quickly, searching for signs of weakness or indifference. The cowboy, in turn, studied them with the patience of a man accustomed to reading both animals and humans, noticing the way they balanced fear with necessity, how survival had etched lines of caution into their small bodies. A sudden gust rattled the barn boards, and snow fell in fine shards through the cracks above, dusting the straw at their feet. The horse shied slightly, ears flicking toward the sound, and one of the girls whimpered softly. Instinctively, he reached for a blanket from his saddlebag, its coarse wool rough but warm. Kneeling beside them, he wrapped it gently around the youngest, pulling the edges snug to block the creeping cold. The girls exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and skepticism, as if the warmth might be a trick of the wind rather than the result of human kindness. "I'm Jonah," he said finally, letting his name linger in the air, a small offering of identity in a place that had none for them. "And this here is Casey." He nodded toward the horse, whose head now rested tentatively near the youngest girl's shoulder. The horse's eyes were wide, reflecting the dim light, patient and still, as if it understood the import of this meeting. One of the older girls reached out slowly to touch Casey's neck, and the animal responded with a gentle nicker, a sound that seemed to echo across the frozen silence and into the cowboy's chest. The middle girl, careful and deliberate, finally spoke, her voice thin and wavering but firm with necessity. We didn't want to leave him," she said, glancing down at Casey, the horse that had become both shield and companion. Jonah nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. The choice to stay had been theirs, though it had come with unbearable risk. Survival was not always about running. Sometimes it was about standing firm, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He could see the moral logic in their actions, a fragile courage that mirrored his own life's unacknowledged struggles. He reached into the saddlebag again, retrieving a small tin of dried corn he had carried for the mare. Handfuls scattered toward Casey, who nibbled gratefully, still keeping a careful eye on the girls. As the horse ate, Jonah knelt beside them, speaking softly in measured tones. "We'll get through this, one step at a time. No one's leaving anyone behind." He did not promise safety in the absolute sense. Such assurances were lies. But he promised presence, a commodity rarer than gold in these parts. The girls listened, absorbing his words with a caution tempered by the warmth of proximity, the subtle relief that someone larger than themselves now shared their burden. The storm outside began to thicken, snowflakes scattering like tiny shards of glass against the barn walls. Jonah could hear the wind tearing across the frozen plains, rattling loose timbers and lifting the scent of pine and frost into the rafters. The girls huddled closer, Casey's broad back a barrier against the chill. He felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of urgency and dread. The world beyond this barn was indifferent to 3 small lives and a horse. Yet here, within this fragile enclosure, he had the power to shape the next hour, the next day. The responsibility pressed against him, cold and heavy, yet electric with purpose. Time slowed, measured in shallow breaths and the horse's shifting weight. Jonah observed the subtle interactions, the youngest curling into the blanket, the middle girl scanning the shadows for threats, the oldest brushing snow from Casey's mane with deliberate care. Each movement revealed a story of endurance, of tiny sacrifices and unspoken lessons learned through hardship. He realized that this moment, brief, as it might be in the sweep of history, held the potential to change the trajectory of lives. And he knew, with the clarity that comes to those who have walked too many cold miles alone, that turning away was no longer an option. A distant sound caught his attention, a low rumble, the faint echo of movement outside the barn. He stood, squinting toward the small cracks in the walls, listening. The girls stiffened, gripping the horse, and he raised a hand to quiet them. Whatever waited beyond could be wind, or it could be something more sinister. Either way, he would not falter. The moral weight of the choice pressed upon him, to act or to remain indifferent. Action, he understood, was not always heroic in the grand sense. Sometimes it was simply the courage to keep moving when fear demanded stillness. He stepped fully into the barn, closing the door gently behind him, the cold from outside chasing him in a thin wave. The girls watched him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, eyes wide but no longer pleading. Jonah took a slow breath, letting the warmth of shared body heat settle, and began to move among them, securing the blankets, checking fingers and noses for frostbite, murmuring instructions that were more guidance than order. Casey shifted alongside him, nuzzling the children, offering reassurance through muscle and warmth rather than speech. For the first time since the morning began, the barn seemed to breathe, a subtle pulse of life through straw, horse, and small, fragile humans. Jonah's chest loosened, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, tenuous but real. He looked down at the girls, noting the smallest tilt of head, the flicker of comprehension in eyes that had seen too much for their years. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and persistent, but inside, in this barn, a fragile warmth had taken hold, a signal that survival might not depend solely on circumstance, but on the deliberate, stubborn choices of those willing to act. And in that suspended moment, Jonah knew that the morning's discovery was only the beginning. The wind howled, the horse shifted, and the children pressed closer. Yet the barn was no longer a place of fear alone. It was a threshold, a point at which compassion met necessity. And the question remained, what lay beyond these walls, and could courage endure long enough to confront it? The answer, Jonah understood, would come with each step forward, each careful, deliberate motion of hands and heart. The storm outside had thickened by mid-afternoon, snow driven across the valley in relentless sheets that rattled the barn walls and painted the landscape in shades of white and gray. Inside, the barn felt smaller, cozier, yet more confining as Jonah moved among the girls, checking fingers and cheeks for frostbite and adjusting blankets around their shoulders. The horse, Casey, had settled into a quiet vigilance, ears flicking toward every sound, nostrils flaring, hooves shifting nervously on the straw. Jonah's gaze traveled the interior, noting the subtle signs of long neglect. A broken feeding trough, a pile of spoiled hay, footprints in the dust that led to shadowed corners. These were not mere traces of children seeking refuge. They were markers of endurance under conditions that no one should have had to endure. Jonah crouched by a small crate, brushing aside the straw to reveal a scattering of rotted food, crusted and infested with small insects. He frowned, realizing that the girls had eaten little more than the scraps they could find on their own. The horse had fared no better, her flanks thin beneath the matted coat, ribs faintly visible even beneath the frosted hair. Jonah's hand rested briefly on Casey's neck, the warmth of the animal pressing against his palm a reminder that life had persisted against the cold and neglect. This barn had sheltered them, yes, but it was no sanctuary. It was a stopgap in a world that had turned its back. He turned to the girls, who now huddled closer together in a triangle of tentative safety, each watching him with guarded eyes. Their faces, pale from cold and exhaustion, carried expressions older than their years. The youngest clutched the horse's mane, middle fingers weaving through the coarse hair, while the oldest seemed to scan the shadows constantly, aware of dangers invisible to Jonah but real to them. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly, careful not to startle them. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The oldest girl finally spoke, her voice low but steady. They're not here. Been gone a long time." Her words were sparse, precise, measured, evidence of repeated rehearsals, perhaps, or a survival mechanism learned over months, maybe years. The middle girl added quietly, "The neighbors, they don't come. Nobody comes." Jonah's heart tightened, not with surprise, but with the grim recognition of what he suspected. These children had been abandoned, left to face the cold and hunger with only each other and a horse for protection. His attention shifted to the small bundle of papers in a corner, partially buried under straw and frozen dust. Letters, notes, scraps of what might once have been an effort at care, now yellowed and unreadable, spilled into the floorboards as he touched them. He gathered a few, brushing off frost to reveal scribbled apologies, ration lists, and reminders that had never been followed. The parents' handwriting trembled across the page, yet the substance of the messages revealed negligence more than misfortune. Empty promises, delayed visits, excuses instead of action. Jonah felt a tight coil of anger and sorrow, but he did not speak it aloud. Anger here would not help. Only action could meet the cruelty that had gone unchallenged. Outside, the wind's howl intensified, and the barn shivered under the assault of snow-laden gusts. Jonah glanced toward the cracked windows and the warped boards of the wall. He understood, with painful clarity, that the world outside, the officials, neighbors, those who might have noticed and yet did not, was indifferent. The law, bureaucracy, and reputation had all failed these children. He had no choice but to become the agent of care they had been denied. He set the papers aside and moved back toward the girls, taking a seat on an overturned crate to show a measured calm, his voice low but firm. "We're going to need a plan," he said. "Step by step, we get you safe, and we get answers." The girls exchanged glances, a flicker of recognition passing between them. For the first time, Jonah noticed a subtle shift. They were assessing him, measuring whether he could be trusted to carry through his words. He understood this instinctively. Trust, once broken, was earned only through consistent, deliberate actions. He began to instruct them on small tasks, stacking straw for warmth, brushing snow from Casey's coat, keeping the barn tidy to reduce hazards. The girls obeyed, silent but attentive, learning that his presence brought not threats but stability. Night began to descend, the pale light of day dissolving into shadows that flickered beneath the barn's eaves. Jonah lit a small lantern, its glow spilling across the straw and casting the girls' faces in soft, amber light. He moved among them again, checking blankets and adjusting the horse's tether. Each action, deliberate and careful, communicated more than words could, that he would stay, that he would protect, and that he expected cooperation without fear. The storm outside raged, but within these walls, a fragile order had emerged, a microcosm of safety in the middle of chaos. Jonah's thoughts returned to the tracks he had seen leading to the barn. He crouched by the doorway again, examining the prints partially buried under new snow and scuffed by the horse's hooves. They were too small for an adult, confirming what he had begun to suspect. Someone else had come through here, leaving signs of life that had gone unnoticed by the outside world. Perhaps neighbors, perhaps another child. But what unsettled him was the possibility that whoever had been here before had been careless, leaving these girls exposed. His jaw tightened. Survival had been left to chance, and chance was a cruel caretaker. He rose and moved toward the back of the barn, following a faint trail that led to a narrow alcove beneath an old loft. The air smelled stronger here, a mix of damp wood and old hay, and he found evidence of temporary bedding. Thin, tattered blankets and a few items of clothing, likely the girls' own, left to shield them from the floor. It was a system of survival, but one that was precarious and morally bankrupt. Jonah's hand hovered over the items, absorbing the quiet story they told. Neglect, resilience, fear, and ingenuity interwoven into the simple arrangements of blankets and straw. The girls watched silently, sensing that he had discovered something beyond words. Jonah looked down at them, noting the way their eyes flickered between him and the horse, between hope and lingering doubt. "We're going to need help," he said, his voice low but carrying certainty. "Not just to get through the night, but to make sure no one forgets you again." The youngest clutched Casey's mane more tightly, and for the first time, Jonah saw something like relief pass through her expression. They understood, in that moment, that their lives were no longer entirely at the mercy of neglect. He returned to the center of the barn, kneeling beside them once more. "You've survived this far because you looked out for each other. That's good. That's strong. But now we do it together, all of us." The oldest girl nodded slightly, middle flicking a glance at him, weighing the truth of his words. The bond had begun, fragile and tentative but real. Outside, the storm continued. The wind's howl, now a distant roar behind the barn's weathered walls. But inside, Jonah felt a quiet certainty settling over the group. He could see the storm as a trial, an external mirror of the cruelty they had endured. But for now, within the barn, there was warmth, light, and deliberate action. They had survived abandonment and indifference. But Jonah understood that the coming hours would demand more than survival. They would demand courage, insight, and persistence, qualities forged not in comfort, but in the cold and the shadow of cruelty. And he was ready to provide them, step by step, because leaving them now would be more than failure. It would be complicity. The barn held its fragile quiet, interrupted only by the soft breathing of the girls and the steady nicker of Casey. Jonah rose, brushing straw from his coat, and looked toward the small opening where the storm raged. He knew the next step would require leaving the safety of this space, facing the world that had so far ignored them. But he also knew, without hesitation, that action was inevitable. Survival, justice, and care were inseparable in this place. And as the girls huddled closer together, waiting, he whispered to himself, "We'll see it through. We have to." Jonah stepped from the barn into the gray light of late afternoon, the wind still tearing across the snow-laden valley, biting at exposed skin and whipping the edges of his coat. The girls huddled behind Casey, shivering, but steadying themselves with the quiet strength of those who had learned to endure. The footprints in the snow led back toward the Miller homestead, the dilapidated frame of it barely visible through the swirling storm. Jonah's jaw was set, eyes scanning the distance, calculating the steps he would take. He knew the moment required more than courage. It demanded deliberate action, the kind that could not be rushed, the kind that carried consequences heavier than any single man's strength. The house was a squat, weather-beaten structure, sagging under the weight of years and neglect. Windows were cracked, shutters hanging unevenly, and smoke from a crooked chimney rose thin and gray into the cold sky. Jonah approached with measured steps, feeling the frost stiffen his joints, but pressing forward nonetheless. He had thought about this moment all morning, considered retreat, but the girl's eyes, wide with silent questions, had left no room for hesitation. Action was the only option, and he would bear it alone if necessary. He rapped his knuckles on the warped doorframe, the sound echoing hollowly through the empty yard. Inside, a figure stirred, a man, gaunt and startled, eyes sharp with suspicion. Jonah's presence was a challenge, silent but immediate. "We need to talk," Jonah said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of authority without arrogance. The man's eyes darted to the snow tracks, then to the barn behind Jonah. Recognition and fear mingled in his expression. He knew, as Jonah did, that the evidence was undeniable. The girls peered around Casey's shoulder, watching the confrontation with a mixture of dread and hope. The oldest clutched the youngest's hand, a reminder that even amid danger, they were not alone. Jonah did not allow his gaze to falter. He met the man squarely, letting silence press its own weight. Finally, the man spoke, voice quavering, avoiding the directness of responsibility. They're just children," he said, almost to himself, a weak attempt at justification. "They'll be fine. His words fell short, fractured by the weight of truth that Jonah's presence made undeniable. Jonah's reply was measured, every word deliberate. "They've survived the storm, yes. They've survived hunger and cold and neglect. But the time for excuses is past. You've left them to chance, and chance doesn't care. The wind lifted, scattering snow across the yard like tiny shards of glass, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The man swallowed, pale and shrinking beneath Jonah's steady gaze, understanding fully that moral power outweighed any claim of authority or ownership he might have believed he possessed. With careful precision, Jonah guided the girls forward, ensuring they remained between him and the man. He motioned to Casey, who stepped calmly, sensing the gravity of the moment. The youngest girl clutched his coat, middle glancing at him with that measured, wary intelligence he had come to recognize. Jonah did not raise his voice, did not resort to threats. He let his presence, steady and unyielding, communicate that the children were under his protection and that the world's indifference would no longer define their fate. The man finally slumped into a chair, exhaustion and fear overtaking pride. Jonah produced the papers he had collected in the barn, spreading them across the snow-crusted table. Letters, ration notes, scraps of failed care. They all spoke with undeniable clarity. "These are records of neglect," Jonas said, voice low but carrying across the silent room. "And you cannot escape what they show. You've left them exposed, not by accident, but by choice." The man looked down at the papers, shoulders sagging, the weight of accountability pressing him towards silent confession. Outside, the storm had begun to ease, snow falling in lighter, crystalline threads that caught the pale light of late day. Jonah glanced back toward the barn, toward the girls and Casey, noting how the horse nuzzled the youngest and the oldest's eyes brightened slightly, the relief barely visible but profound. This was the moment when patience, moral persistence, and quiet courage aligned. Justice was not delivered through violence, nor was it shouted into existence. It arrived slowly, deliberately, through evidence, compassion, and the refusal to turn away. Jonah spoke again, his tone steady, unwavering. "They'll be safe now. You cannot take that away, and the law will see this for what it is." The man nodded mutely, eyes lowering, finally conceding not only to Jonah's authority, but to a deeper understanding of his own failings. The girls, for their part, began to relax, still close to Casey, but allowing themselves the smallest movements of relief. The tension that had gripped the barn, the yard, and the house itself began to ease, replaced with the fragile warmth of safety finally recognized and enacted. Jonah guided the girls and the horse back across the yard, toward a sleigh he had prepared, the blankets bundled and secured, provisions packed for warmth and sustenance. He moved carefully, mindful of the uneven snow, the slippery patches of ice, and the fragile spirits of those in his care. The girls remained close, hands tucked into the folds of blankets, but their faces carried the first signs of trust that had not been fully possible in weeks. Casey's hose made soft impressions in the snow, marking the path of their escape from neglect toward care and protection. As the sleigh slid smoothly over the crusted snow, Jonah allowed himself a rare glance over his shoulder at the homestead. The man remained seated, staring blankly through the falling snow, a silent witness to the accountability that had arrived without violence, but with undeniable force. Jonah understood fully that this confrontation, though brief, would resonate far beyond the valley. It was a reckoning of moral power versus indifference, of quiet courage overcoming systemic cruelty. The girl's safety was the first victory. The truth was the second, unyielding and absolute. Night fell fully as the sleigh reached a safe distance, the valley bathed in muted silver light reflecting off the snow. Jonah secured the girls inside a small cabin he had prepared, warmth already radiating from the hearth. Casey was tethered nearby, muscles relaxed, eyes soft and vigilant. The girls began to unbundle themselves, tentative movements turning into small, careful stretches of body and spirit. Jonah moved among them, offering food, adjusting blankets, and speaking softly about the hours ahead. His voice was not grand, but steady, embodying the quiet reassurance that had guided them this far. In the stillness of the cabin, Jonah paused at the doorway, looking back toward the valley. Snow continued to fall, pale and relentless, yet the landscape now held a subtle promise of renewal. He had faced the weight of cruelty, navigated the indifference of the world, and emerged not through force, but through persistence, clarity, and compassion. The girls were safe, Casey content, and the moral arc of the day bent just slightly toward justice. He knelt briefly beside the youngest, brushing a hand across her hair. "You're safe now," he said simply, "and no one can take that from you." Her small fingers closed over his hand, trust conveyed without words. Jonah allowed himself a rare breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For once, the cold did not bite so sharply. He had seen despair and acted, and in the act, restored a measure of balance to a world that had turned away too long. Outside, the wind stilled, leaving only the soft whisper of falling snow. Jonah looked toward the distant horizon, the sun hidden behind clouds, but casting pale gold light that shimmered across the valley floor. He felt the weight of the day, of responsibility, of moral reckoning, lift slightly. The girl's laughter, soft, uncertain, but present, rose from the cabin, mingling with the nicker of Casey, and a quiet sense of completion settled in his chest. He turned fully to the cabin, watching the trio of children and the steadfast horse he had come to care for deeply. Some lessons, he reflected, came only to those who refused to give up. Some acts of courage were quiet, deliberate, and nearly invisible, yet their consequences could ripple across lives in ways the world might never acknowledge. He allowed himself a small smile, a private acknowledgement of the day's truth, that kindness, persistence, and moral clarity had prevailed, at least for now. And as the stars began to prick the sky, faint and cold, Jonah whispered softly to no one but himself, and perhaps to the valley itself. Some loss can always follow a trail of care, and those who refuse to abandon hope will always find the way. Outside, the snow fell, indifferent, relentless. Inside, the cabin held warmth, safety, and the quiet certainty of justice enacted. The story, for now, had found its balance, its truth, and its fragile human heart.